Welcome back. I am Largo, and today we're checking out another commenter suggestion. This is the Fallen of World War II. I'm a big history fan, a big history buff. I really enjoy learning about historical events, and World War II is probably one of, if not the most interesting event in human history as far as I'm concerned. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'm really interested to see this. I always like visual breakdowns of things like this. So let's go ahead and take a look at it and see how it plays out.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years. And an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began.
Okay.
A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us.
Yeah, most people have passed.
And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost.
Yeah. Yep.
This project
Look
is
at
not
all those
about
lines
individual
that
war
stop
stories,
right there.
and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives are cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately.
Okay.
Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life. Whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often...
Yeah, casualty does not mean death. From a military perspective, casualty means you can no longer participate in the fight. So if you were in battle and you stepped on a mine and had both your feet blown off and you can no longer fight in the battle, you are considered a casualty. A lot of people misconstrue that, and they correlate the word casualty with death. And in military parlance, a casualty and a death are two separate things.
Often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths, and we'll begin with American soldiers.
Okay, so we're gonna go country by country. All right. Each one represents 1,000.
Over 400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. In about
History could have went a different way, and those numbers could have equaled out. We could have lost as many in the Pacific theater if the war wasn't ended abruptly the way it was.
about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the US wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in.
Yeah, the Americans had an isolationist stance during the beginning of the war, and they didn't want to be involved with it. However, they would send supplies and gear and stuff over to the Allies, even before they entered the war officially.
The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell.
One of the most well-known.
So about the same number of US soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan. The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe.
Okay. We're going to see some really interesting numbers here, especially especially when we get to the Soviet Union.
Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland.
Oof,
Poland ultimately
man.
lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union.
They had it rough. Really, really bad.
Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides. But the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions.
You'll see here that Germany doesn't lose as many as some of these other countries, and that's because of their battle strategy, their blitzkrieg strategy, where they would strike so hard and so fast that the enemy would just capitulate. They couldn't react fast enough to what was happening to put up a good enough fight.
The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses.
Yeah.
Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success.
It was the speed of their takeover which essentially caught everybody off guard. Like, by the time that you were ready to prepare for a fight with them, you were already being invaded.
And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium.
Oh boy, here it comes. Woo! I'm familiar with the history of World War II, so if you're not, buckle up.
But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front, Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad.
My God, you guys have no idea, dude. Stalingrad was like hell on earth, man. That was some intense fighting.
The German 6th Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
And the numbers keep going.
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers.
Yeah, but look what it cost them.
But winning the war came at a cost.
And it keeps going. Look at this, man. This is so sad. Victory paid for in blood.
8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead.
Look at the bar graph. Holy sh...
To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis: Hungary, Romania, and Italy.
The African campaign was such a mess.
When you put these European military deaths on the
Whoa,
timeline,
look
it looks
at it.
like this. And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe.
Bonkers. Oh, and here comes the super sad part. The civilians, the men,
6
women, and children
million
who
Jewish
wanted
people were
nothing to do
killed in
with
the
it.
Holocaust. If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish.
Poland, yeah.
700,000 were Soviets,
Yeah,
followed by
Poland got it
Hungary
so
and
bad.
17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps. Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station. Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews.
This is a pretty
Like
famous
with the gas
photo right
chambers,
here.
men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
I mean, we won't even go into the things that happened in those camps, but they were very much real. It absolutely happened, and it was horrific, absolutely horrific. It's easily one of the biggest stains on humanity as a whole. Like the willingness to inflict such suffering on ourselves is just mind-boggling.
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma,
The
then called
elderly, the
gypsies, were
disabled,
killed. The numbers are disputed.
people of color, just
About
all
a quarter
kinds of
million
stuff.
people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated,
Yep.
but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation, some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian
Man.
and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country,
16%.
but not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers,
Ugh.
somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet
Insane.
Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years. 1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians. Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers.
Oh, for sure.
He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitz.
Not that they didn't try. The United Kingdom was not invaded, but they were next on the chopping block. They were the next up in line, and the only thing that really saved them was the fact that they were an island. They had such a ferocious air force, and then they had allied support from the French and from the Americans and stuff like that. They really stood their ground. They were really the last bulwark of allied forces in Europe. There was really no one else to stand against them in Europe at that point. So it was a legendary feat.
Often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths.
The RAF,
But most German
man,
civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war.
don't mess with the RAF.
When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million.
A lot of that is anger, man. Anger at what had happened, anger at invasion of their own country, so that when the Soviets, when it was their turn to push forward and push the Nazis out of the Soviet Union and continue that push to all the way to Germany, they brought that anger with them. That they remembered how many people died in the invasion, the attempted invasion of the Soviet Union. So they brought that anger with them, and it was not pretty. It was not pretty. A lot of people died that didn't have to die, that shouldn't have died, but there's such animosity and anger and vengeance on both sides that it just got so messy.
Let's step back and see where we are with the totals.
22 million.
We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million.
41 million.
Then we have the Asian theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan.
They were the biggest players in the Asian theater. Japan was the primary aggressor, and China was the primary victim. There's a lot of social and cultural animosity between the two countries, and a lot of that animosity comes from World War II, because even though Japan was the smaller country with the smaller population, boy, they took the fight to everyone, and they were extremely efficient at it, and they were ferocious in battle, and they were able to conquer so much territory, even though they're just a tiny island nation themselves. It's a little bonkers, but they did it through incredibly brutal means.
On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You cannot forget or justify or downplay the things that the Japanese did during the war. It was absolutely horrific and absolutely atrocious, and easily comparable to the horrific things that the Nazis did in war, in the death camps and all of that. It's easily comparable. There's so much to go into with this war.
China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people.
Yeah, that's also the other thing, is both the Soviet Union and China, because they have so many people, were willing to sacrifice millions of people in an attempt to win a war.
Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance.
It's so bad.
500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed.
Killed a bunch of civilians.
Which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis. But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks.
Yeah. You could actually, and I know this on its face sounds a little backwards, but one could argue that the firebombing of Japan was actually worse than the nuclear bombs. The nuclear bombs, yeah, they absolutely killed a ton of people. There's a couple things you have to take into consideration with it. The nuclear bombs were dropped to end the war quickly, and it did absolutely that. The war ended very quickly after that second bomb was dropped. Estimatedly saved hundreds of thousands of lives on both the Japanese side and the American side, because there was no inclination that the Japanese were ever going to surrender in a traditional confrontation. They were ready to fight. Every man, woman, and child was being prepared for war in Japan. They were ready to fight till the last man, and that would have cost Japan, its civilians, America, and its soldiers, way more civilians and way more soldiers would have died without the 2 nuclear bombs. There's no question about that. And you could say that to a certain extent, the nuclear strikes were more humane because it was very rapid, very instant. That's not the case for everyone. People in the primary blast zones were killed instantly, just wiped from existence. Obviously, there's a lot of people who survived the initial blasts, and there's a ton of terrible things that came with that, from the nuclear radiation, some of the fallout, some of the biological defects that people got from being exposed to radiation. Some of that persisted for decades. But you could make an argument that the fire bombings were almost worse, because you're firebombing civilian structures that are, at the time, most of the buildings in Japan were made of wood. It essentially turned entire cities into tinder boxes that all went up into flames. Much like nuclear bombs, fire is indiscriminate. It does not care about men, women, children, people who don't want to be involved in the war. It just kills indiscriminately. And as you can see here, the number of people who died in the firebombing strikes is easily comparable to the amount of people that died in the nuclear strikes. And they died arguably almost worse deaths. I would say, with the exception of the people who died from radiation poisoning, because that's probably worse, but I would say being burnt alive is worse than being atomized by a nuclear bomb. So, yeah, it's a toss-up, man. It's really hard to say which was worse, but I would say that the fire bombs were worse because not only did they kill nearly as many people, if not more people, than the nuclear bombs, it was just as indiscriminate as the nuclear bombs, yet it was something that honestly didn't even have a chance of ending the war. It was almost just destruction for the sake of destruction, while the 2 nuclear bombs ended the war right then and there. So,
contrary to official U.S. statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets.
Whole cities made of wood.
When you add all the deaths outside Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war. Give or take, depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included.
That's
more people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry.
Yeah.
Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years.
Wow, the Mongol conquest of Asia, essentially. 40 million, which is right up there with Mao, another 40 million, and I believe he starved a bunch of people to death. Wow, man. And World War II was almost double that.
The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this.
Woo!
This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking. When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used. although its meaning may have shifted.
Yeah, on the face of it, it is a little misleading. I think this is referring to major conflicts happening between major world powers, because this clearly does not include smaller conflicts, probably things like civil wars where a country just fights amongst itself. There's still been conflicts and genocides and all these other horrible things, revolutions, revolts, things like that. But that's different than two major world powers going full-fledged war against each other, especially, world powers that have nuclear weapons. So, I mean, this seems like a pretty well thought out video. I'm sure they'll get into that in just a second, but I would assume it doesn't include any of those conflicts.
European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale.
Right.
And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq.
Right.
But rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire. To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories.
Okay.
We don't see colonial wars anymore.
Wars of colonization, right? That's kind of over now. Nobody's really attempting to claim land or to take over or dominate countries anymore. Of course, there's an exception with the whole Russia-Ukraine thing right now. Obviously, they're trying to completely take over Ukraine and essentially wipe it out and absorb it back into the Russian state, which, come on, Russia. Civil wars with foreign intervention. Okay, yeah, so
we've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all. And here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals.
I would say...
Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline.
I would say that a big part of that is one thing that we did learn from World War II is how intricately and intimately a lot of our economies are tied together. And regardless of religious or ideological differences that countries may have, there seems to be, and I think we all have learned this, there seems to be one thing that is more powerful and more impactful to every country than ideology or religion or something like that, is the economy, money. Like, even if you were to win a war and dominate someone else's ideology, if you do not have a strong enough economy to support yourself, you're done. You're over. I mean, that's it. Someone else will come over and take over. And, whoever controls the purse strings has the power. You can look at Saudi Arabia to see how influential money has. Saudi Arabia can in no way compete on a military basis with countries like the United States or Russia or major military powers. But guess what? They can still shove people around politically because they have the money to do so, because they control a lot of the world's oil. We've all learned that money is a super important thing, that a strong, stable economy is almost more important than anything else. The world leaders and countries as a whole have realized that you cannot afford to be devastated that bad because your country may never, ever recover from it.
Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened.
How do you account for peace? How do you calculate
We give such importance
peace?
to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does.
Video's almost 10 years old.
But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
That was the Fallen of World War II, a very historically based, it was basically an infographic that put into perspective visually the number of deaths during World War II, separated by country and by civilian and military deaths. Very well done, very interesting. I always love taking a look at these videos that are very informative, very educational. Like they said at the very beginning of this video, the people who were there, the people who participated in World War II, they are almost all gone now. So it is very easy for people to forget how important this was, how impactful it was. So really appreciate Neil here creating this for us, because it's something that we always need to remember, and sometimes people don't really understand the magnitude of things unless it's represented visually for them. And this was done very well. So I really enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed watching it and reacting to it. I hope you guys enjoyed the reaction. And if you did, go ahead and hit that like button. As always, consider hitting that subscribe button to help the channel out. But most importantly, leave a comment down below. What other videos would you like me to check out? Do you have any more educational videos, historical videos like this? Maybe some infographics about something that we could take a look at? So leave your comments down below. Let me know what you guys want me to check out, and we can get to those in the future. As always, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. Thanks for watching the video. Take care of yourselves and have a great day.